when you have your Rhino open, right, in Rhino 5, you have to use the command Grasshopper. In Rhino 6, the first official release of Grasshopper is embedded, so you can actually use the button here to launch it. I'm recording. So yeah, right now you just want to take notes. You don't want to follow along on the software. And I'm letting you know now, I'm probably going to go 5 minutes over just because I want to use the next course to really get into starting using a script, and I want to nail the interface right now with you, okay? So when you type in the command Grasshopper, it's going to pop up with a window. I like to set it up where I have my overall perspective view on the left side, right? And I can see the grid and what I'm working with. And I can see the Grasshopper window on the right side, right? So I can kind of like see what I'm doing on the left side and work on the script on the right. If you have two monitors, that's the best case, right? So you'll notice that Grasshopper actually has its own toolbar up here, like File, Edit, View, History, right? So you have your own options for how Grasshopper works here. And then just like you have your toolbars for your tools down here, you have them right here, right? So it might be just a little different because Rhino here has them all continuously. Like if I go to Curve Tools, it's all just kind of, there's the main ones on the left and some on the top. But in Grasshopper, they're separated by categories. If I go to Curve, right, I have the primitive section, which the primitive is usually the easiest or the most basic way to start generating whatever geometry you're in the tab of. So in this case, curve. And then you have the analysis section sometimes, or division, right? So you know how in Rhino you would type a command to like create a surface, but then you would type a command to say contour a surface? You're not really, if you think about it in these terms, where if you contour a surface, you're not developing the geometry more, you're deconstructing the geometry. Does that make sense? Like you're translating a surface into a series of lines, and you can think of it that way as a deconstruction, right? So Grasshopper works very much like that. You construct geometry or data, and then you deconstruct it to then build something else or modify something else, right? So how do we do that? So the most recent files will show up here. If they're green, they're there. If they're red, you move them. And then this is the canvas. So this is where you place your components, right? Which are the blocks that run commands, right? Essentially. So there's two ways to place a component on the canvas. You can either select it from the tools. So if I go to the vector tab, right? Under vectors, I have fields, which are kind of like magnetic forces or gravitational forces that you can apply. You have grids, planes, right? The difference between a point and a plane is that a point has a coordinate in space, right? Like X, Y, and Z, right? But a plane also has its own orientation. So maybe the plane, even though this is X, Y, and Z, the default point is going to have those same X, Y, and Z, right? But a plane might have it different, where this is Y, this is Z, and this is X. Make sense? You'll also have point and vector. So vector is a point with a direction, right? So basically, if you were to draw a line from one point to another, but that line can continue indefinitely, or it can be given a certain distance. But it's not a line, like a line is a geometry, and a vector is a behavior, right, or a force. So you can pick it from up here, and you'll notice that, say if I open up point, right, I usually always start my scripts with a construct point, just because if a construct point turns into a circle, turns into a line, turns into a surface, right, I can attach another script to that one, right? It's just a matter of, am I starting with points, or do I remove the construct point and then introduce curves or surfaces from a separate script, right? So you also want to keep in mind that these inputs and outputs in your script, they can be like sort of stitched together, right? These processes can be stitched together. And you'll notice here, like when you open up the drop-down menu for each category, there's a line, right, that separates the sections. And you can see up here, I have maybe the most basic point operations. Then here I have more analytical ones, right? Calculating distance, where is the point oriented, and so on. And then down here I have maybe more complex components, right? Calculating closest point or closest points. Cull duplicates. So cull means eliminating, right? So you could set a tolerance, like let's say if points are, if you have like 100 points, right? You want to eliminate any point that's a quarter of an inch close to another one, right? So it'll just make a decision on like duplicating duplicate points, right? I'm gonna try and stick to interface, sorry. So also hovering over anything will usually give you more information. So as you can see, I'm hovering over cull duplicates, and it'll give me a little description. Cull points that are coincided within a tolerance, right? Whatever it is, I'll click on it, and I'll see that it's kind of attached to my cursor, right? And I can drop it on the canvas. Now, this border right here, you don't have to worry about too much. It's only that when you export your script as an image, right? You can export as a high resolution image. Anything outside of this boundary is not going to show up in the image, right? So you can like make notes for yourself outside here and things like that, and it won't show up when you export your script to show us your script. So as you can see here, right, we have our inputs on the left and our output on the right. We have a symbol here of what the component is, and then down here we have the amount of resources that it's taking in time, right? So it's at red because this is the profiler, as it says there, and it tells you how much resources it's taking up in time. So it's red because it's the only component, so it's the one taking up the most amount of resources, and it took 75 milliseconds to calculate, right? Now, the display stuff you can change up here, right? So if I take away draw icons, it's going to give me the full name of that component. This is how I used to teach it, because another way to put components on the canvas, you can double click on the canvas and search for it. So you can always search for the title of the component that I have, and then your most relevant results are going to be at the bottom. Now, there's plugins, and plugins usually, I mean, if you have the standard version of Grasshopper, here you'll have up to display, right? But then everything to the right of this is a plugin. So usually plugins might have their own tab, right? But some, like if I go to Mesh, Cocoon, which is a plugin, has put itself into the Mesh tab, right? In parameters, the plugin Bifocals, which I really like, is here. I'll drop it outside of the canvas, because what it does is it adds the title on the top, right? So that way, as I'm teaching, you can search for construct point, right? And you can match the symbol, yeah? So real easy. Now, we see there the point has shown up, right? At the origin. The point can also be changed in display. If you go here, display, you have a lot of options in how your geometry is being previewed in Grasshopper, including what color your standard and selected objects are, what kind of quality it renders at. So sometimes you might see a mesh or a poly surface that has a boundary, and the surface seems like it doesn't quite meet the corner. Almost like the surface is like offset or missing from that corner, right? That might just mean that you have it on low quality or custom quality. So if you put high quality, you'll see that start to fill in. You'll see the most accurate version of the geometry that you're working with. So you could just change the preview of the point here to a dot or to a point. I guess that one's the biggest one. It might be easier to see for you. Okay, so it's there, right? So what if I wanted to change the point somewhere else, right? Well, if I wanted to change the parameters that affect this point, I'd have to take a look at the inputs, right? And like I said earlier, hovering over anything is going to pretty much give you more details on how it works, right? So if I hover over X coordinate, it'll tell me X coordinate, right, as the title, and then in the description, X coordinate. Sometimes it'll be a little more specific. And then underneath it says one locally defined value, 0, right? Locally meaning that the value is within the component, not coming from somewhere else, right? And one value meaning that there's not multiple values being plugged in there, right? So the same thing if I were to place a point in Rhino. If I typed point, right? I can just click somewhere on the canvas to place a point, right? However, if I type 10, it's gonna refer that to, oh, if I type 10, 10, 10, 10, it'll place the point, right? Show points. Well, you get what I'm trying to get across, I guess, right? If you were to type in, it would ask you for each coordinate. So same thing here, right? How can I apply a value here? Well, if I hover over the black hexagon with the white typeface and the symbol, right? That's the data type it's asking for, right? So you can't plug in a point where a curve is being asked for, right? You can't plug in a mesh where a surface is being asked for, right? So to make sure that you have the right type, you can go to the parameters tab, and then here you have your data types. So here they are for geometry, and then here they are for values or numbers or file paths and so on, right, for data. So if I look for that number, right, it says here 0.1, it's a number. Contains a collection of floating point numbers. Does anybody know the difference between an integer and a floating point? A floating point has decimals. It's that easy. So you're able to add decimals. Now, if something is asking for an integer, this rarely happens, right? But if something is asking for an integer and you're giving it a floating point, sometimes you could even put that floating point through the integer component and it'll round up or down, right? Or it'll reparameterize that data into whatever data type you're putting it through. I know I'm going really fast. I'm just trying to get this done so you can have your breakfast and go to class or eat lunch or whatever it is you got to do. But if I'm going too fast, slow me down. I am recording, so you'll be able to watch this over and over and over again if you want to. And again, everything I'm saying is detailed with images and text in the resource I'm going to give you. But if you do have any questions that are pertinent that we might as well get over now, interrupt me. I know I'm going fast, but just stop me and I'll get to it. Yeah? So the main way to apply an input over here, right, is under parameters you have here input, right? And you can input numbers, you can input colors, you can import an image or a file into the script, right? So the easiest thing is a number slider. So if I use the default number slider, we can see here it goes from 0 to 1 with 3 decimal places, right? If I type number slider in the canvas, same thing, right? However, if I type 1, I also get a number slider. But because I didn't put a decimal place, it's only going through integers, right? And because I typed 1, and 1 is a value that's between 0 and 1, the number slider is going from 0 to 1, right? One or the other. However, if I were to type 2, the number slider goes from 0 to 10, right? If I type 11, it goes from 0 to 100, right? And it scales. If I were to type 1.11, I get 1 to 0 to 10 with 2 decimal places. Right? So whatever format you put it in, that's kind of how it's going to show up on the canvas. So let's say for x, I put in 10, right? So I can see how the point looks like, right, with the x value as I'm changing it live, right? If it's a number that's not going to change, I'd recommend using a panel. So a panel has a few uses, sorry. So it says right there, double click to edit panel content. So I can place a number in here if it's not going to change, and this is going to make the script run way faster. Because if you have a really complex script, each number slider is retaining a lot of data. It's retaining a minimum value, a maximum value, or an actual value, and either floating point or integer, right, data. Whereas if I were to just type here 5, all the panel's remembering is 5, right? So once you scale your script to something really complex, this is going to make a difference. So numbers that are not changing, you want to put into panels.
That panel's not necessarily doing anything to the script, right?
Not yet.
No? Oh.
Not yet, right? So the nodes, which are these little semicircles, right? If they're on the right side of the component, they're an output. If they're on the left side, they're an input. So I click and drag from one node to another, right? And then that value has now been plugged in, right? To disconnect, I can right click on the input or the output, disconnect, and then whatever is connected here is going to show up in red as I hover over it, and I can disconnect it. The cool thing here is that, say I do a multiplier, right? So I can add multiplication, which obviously is found in your maths tab, right? You can run a lot of calculations and trigonometry things out of here. So I can make z dependent on x, right? Where z will always be, right, whatever alteration of x, right? So x and z are changing simultaneously here. Yeah? So if I wanted to put more values than 1 into z, right? Let's say I wanted 2 points, right? And I wanted 2 points that have the same x and y values, but I want the other one to have a multiplier that's double that one, right? So instead of sliding to 1.8, I can double click on the where the numbers are, and I can type 1.8, enter. And I can connect that now here. Now if I just connect it, it's going to replace the one that's there. If I click and drag and then hold shift, I can see a little plus sign pop up, and I can merge these here, right? The more proper way of doing this could be to use a merge component, right? Why? Because if I have to change where this value is coming from, I have to continuously disconnect everything that's there, right? And then reconnect one by one what I want there. Whereas the merge will just have one wire going to that input, and then I can continuously add values to the merge component or replace them at different points. Make sense? Any questions about wires, connecting inputs to outputs, and so on? Yeah?
So you can't change the value in the panel, like what you type 5 that.
No, you can.
Okay.
It's just you can't slide it like you could with a number slider. So you could just type 2. Now the thing is, Grasshopper is much more programming oriented than 3D modeling is, right? Like any 3D modeling software that you use, Revit, Rhino, Maya, whatever it is, a computer programmer said, okay, how can I make someone that doesn't understand programming at all use a 3D modeling software? And that's what an interface is. It's basically like how you can interact with a program, which is code, but for people that don't know code, right? So Grasshopper is still that, but it's a visual programming language. So it's still a programming language like Python or C# is. It just, instead of typing in text continuously, you have a combination of text and components that connect with wires, right? 3ds Max has visual programming, Unreal Engine, Unity, all of these have visual programming aspects embedded into them for texturing, for animation, etc. Okay, so the reason I brought that up is because in programming, right, if I have a line, right, that has the value 2 in it, so if I hit enter, I've now started a new line, right? So if I click out of it, it's going to give me an error over here, and it's going to show up in red. And I can find out more about this error by clicking the bubble over here, or hovering over it. So it says this object contains one error. Data conversion failed from text to number, right? The reason for that is that it's reading an empty line of text, but that has nothing in it, right? So those things that are very essential in programming sometimes show up in Grasshopper where you might not expect it to, especially if you don't understand these fundamentals of programming. So we'll try to hit these things as we go. And the main thing with Grasshopper, like anything else really, is the consistency and the practice. I used Grasshopper for 2 months before I made anything that was useful or relevant to me, right? And that was because I taught myself. Well, nobody ever taught me. I taught myself up to today. So it's a trial and error, trial and error, trial and error. And I made the same mistakes a bunch of times until I figured out what it was that was going wrong, right? Lucky for you, you have me and you have other people here that have been working with us for a while, and they can answer a lot of these questions. And there's also everyone on the internet. So, yeah. The Grasshopper forums are really, really active. You can search for scripts that you might be interested in, and probably someone has uploaded their script into the Grasshopper forums asking for help. and someone has very likely fixed their script for them and explained what they did wrong, right? So everything is out there. It's just going to take a little bit of time and practice to get to it, especially because of what I'm explaining, that as in architecture, we're very disassociated from the back end of the tools that we use, right? We're not we don't, again, the interface is what we see and what we generally concern ourselves with. So now that we're getting into Grasshopper and robotics and machinery and like this whole other world, the part that's going to be, I think, a little challenging is like altering your approach or your mentality on 3D modeling and all these processes to incorporate some of these things of programming culture, right? So for the panel, I need to either leave the second line empty, right, and click out of it, or I need to put a number or something that can be understood by the component. Or I guess not. It just has to be, I've never tried that before actually. So I guess it just has to be one number. And it'll read as an integer. Okay, that's 1120. That's really the basics. There's a few things that I wanted to mention as well, but the next time I see you guys, so for a long time, I wanted to, well, you saw my thesis, right? I did an entire project just through scripts, right? And up until a couple months ago, I was still working that way. And for the amount of projects I'm getting in now, I'm actually using both. So I go back and forth between Rhino and Grasshopper because there's things that are just more straightforward in Rhino that I just need to like try, see if it works, model it, 3D print it, whatever, get it done. And then there's more complex things that I want to more investigate that I do through Grasshopper. So that's the part that I wanted to get to that I'll start with next session. And we'll start looking at how to create geometries that depend on each other and relate to each other next time. RDF lab schedule is going to be Tuesdays and Fridays, 10 to 6. Well, that's when I'm here. We'll probably be open every day of the week, but there'll be different people in here. So you'll be able to come in and make use of the printers once we get the training schedule for robots, 3D printing, and Grasshopper workshops. I encourage you to come to those if you plan on using those tools for the project that you're going to develop for this course. So if you're planning on using Grasshopper, which I think Hadi's going to make you use Grasshopper, in the class I'll go over the essentials and I'll give you templates like for using the robot. But if you're planning on using Grasshopper to design, come to the workshops. If you're planning on 3D printing, using the workshop, CNCing, like we're going to have the woodworking, CNCing, metalworking training at the wood shop as well. So for now, I'm just letting you know, the wood shop is only going to be closed on Saturdays. We're going to keep the same schedule as the spring, or even more extended, 10 to 8, Sunday to Friday. And the RDF lab schedule, workshops and trainings will be Tuesdays and Fridays, and we'll be open to you guys for the resources Monday, Wednesday, Thursdays. Okay? All right. So Hadi or